and welcome to the last podvid on the basic mechanisms that appear in Fight Your Own Battles. This one didn't feature actually in our simple game because we really only had one or two elements on the table, and you'll see why it didn't feature when we talk about it. Let me just take you back a step to continuous momentum and what continuous momentum does. It looks at the element on the table and it decides whether or not, for the bound on which tests are taken, there are any penalties that that element has to endure, and in going forward, whether its continuous momentum score holds up, which affects how it operates generally, whether it's able to advance, whether it just needs to hide in a hole until it feels better. Now that's great for the NCO who is leading his particular platoon, but it doesn't say an awful lot about what's going on around him. It could well be that he is the only NCO that's suffering from that particular problem. It could be that the whole army is suffering from that particular problem. Well, what we need is a way for the player or the commander of the force to take a more kind of holistic view about the condition of his forces and make a decision as to whether or not he is going to stay in the field, whether he is going to abandon whatever it is he's trying to do, or perhaps abandon an area that he's trying to defend. So continuous momentum only does that on a local basis, so we want something a bit more holistic, and what we have is a thing called strategic condition. Now, strategic condition is something which is kept and monitored by the highest command on the table. Now, coming back to our simple game, we only had a couple of small forces, so the CO would have been the highest command on the table. But let's say we're playing a bigger game and we've got some platoons of infantry, we might have some artillery, we might have some armour, maybe an armoured car with a recce unit. Each of those elements is going to have a continuous momentum score, and of course, if you remember, continuous momentum scores start at 6. They can be reduced down by the effect of contact with the enemy. They can't go any higher than 6, but they can be rallied back up to 6, or they can improve back up to 6 in certain circumstances. But essentially, each element has this continuous momentum score. Now, the senior officer, very simply, maintains the continuous momentum total. That is the sum of all of the continuous momentum scores for all of his elements on the table. If he's got anything in his back pocket in reserve, that isn't counted, it's just what's on the table. He can now see, using this continuous momentum score, the state of play. Let's say he starts with 3 platoons of infantry, 3 squadrons of tanks, and a recce platoon. So he's got 7 elements, so he'll start with a continuous momentum total of 42. So what we need is a mechanism by which we determine at what point he either throws in some reserves to bolster up the position he's in, or he decides that whatever he's trying to do isn't going to work and he pulls out of the table. Well, that mechanism is to do with the strategic condition of his force. Now, he starts with a strategic condition of green, and it will deteriorate through yellow to red, which obviously is danger, and if it falls below red, then he just abandons the field. Now, before we start looking at the mechanism by which our highest command, the senior commander on the table, has to make these big decisions, let's just remind ourselves that the continuous momentum score of an element can be rallied back up again by a company officer when he is activated. So if one of his platoons has had its continuous momentum score chopped from 6 to 5, the company officer would do good to try to rally that back up to 6. Now, if you look at page 32 of Fight Your Own Battles, you'll see that if he's a below average officer, he gets 1 throw. If he's an average officer, he gets 2 per turn. And if he's above average officer, he also gets 2, but he's able to add 1 pip to one of the throws. Now each of the rallying throws comprise a d6, and if he scores a 6 on that d6, then the element that he chooses gets rallied back up 1 point in its continuous momentum score. It's a very simple way of the company officer, if you like, stepping in and bolstering his troops to make things better. Now he'll do that because when the senior officer is activated, if his continuous momentum total for the force that he's got on the table is starting to fall, he himself is going to be subjected to some tests. So okay, how do we know when a test is due? Well, we have what are called strategic milestones. Now, we said earlier that our force on the table has a total continuous momentum score of 42. Now, in normal everyday general terms, the strategic milestone is set at 10%. That means that when the continuous momentum scores fall by more than 4.2, i.e. 5, then a test is due. A second test is due when it falls by 8.4, i.e. 9, and so it goes on. Now, this 10% is the norm, if you like, but you can play around with that number to reflect different types of troops at different stages of the war. It could well be that if you have some troops that had a bit of a reputation for bailing early, then you can set that milestone at 5%, so that as soon as the continuous momentum scores start to fall, the senior officer is throwing tests, and the more tests he takes, the more chance he's got of failing them, and the quicker his strategic condition will fall from green to yellow to red to getting out of here. On the other side of the coin is, if you look at, for argument's sake, the German troops falling back on Berlin late in the war, the Japanese troops generally, you can set that milestone perhaps to 20%. So they've got to take an awful lot of stick before they get to a point where the commander even thinks about wanting to abandon the table. So let's assume that our strategic milestones have been set at 10%, and our senior officer, when he sees the overall continuous momentum scores of his big force on the table fall from 42 to 37, i.e. by more than 4.2 total, he needs to take a strategic milestone test, and he does that simply by throwing 2d6. If, as it turns out, and this is something that will come in during Fight Your Own Wars, if it turns out that the force are in rationed mode and it's not going well for them on the supply front, then he has to throw an extra 6 as well, an extra d6 as well. But for the minute, let's forget all that, and he's just going to throw 2d6. Incidentally, if when he becomes activated and he looks at his score, it's fallen by 8.4, 9. Therefore, it's gone past 2 milestones. He needs to take 2 sets of tests, and if it falls by 30%, he has to take 3 sets of tests. So it's not just a case of taking one test every time it goes past one of these milestones. They start to build up and build up, so it actually gets worse as time goes on. So he throws his dice, his d6, and if he gets a 1, he throws his 2d6. If he gets a 1 on either of them, then his strategic condition falls by 1 step from green to yellow. If the next time he takes the test it falls from yellow to red, he's now in trouble, because if it falls from red down to sub-red, that's it. It's over for him. There's no way back. Now, he may pass that first 10% milestone test by not throwing a 1 on his 2d6, and that'll be fine. And then, before he's activated again, it could be that some of his commanding officers are activated, and they manage to rally up the continuous momentum score of the platoons that are struggling. And so when the senior command is activated again, he finds that in fact his continuous momentum total is better off than it was originally. So in other words, he passes back past that 10%. Let's say it fell by 5, so he had to take a 10% test. Let's say it's gone back up by 1, so now it's only fallen by 4. So now he's above that 10%. He doesn't have to take any more tests, or indeed he doesn't have to take that test. So he can actually, if you like, untake the test. And by in that sense, retaking that strategic milestone test, he throws his 2d6. If he gets a 6, then any condition that he has suffered, green to yellow for argument's sake, is moved back up to green, so he himself can recover his strategic condition. Another thing he can do is to commit some reserves to the table. Now, there is a military line of thinking that suggests that you don't commit reserves to a sinking ship, but if he has orders to hold a particular position and he has reserves in order to bring into the line in order to do that, then you would expect him to do it. So if he finds that his strategic condition has fallen from green to yellow, he can commit reserves to the table. So he does, if you think about your fight your own battles mechanisms, he activates his reserve unit. He will add an order priority card into the pack for them. They have an order sheet and all the other bits and pieces completed on the sheet, so he knows what they're doing. And of course he gains the benefit of their continuous momentum score. So now he adds up his continuous momentum scores. He sees that they've gone up, that score has gone up by 6. That may take him back past a number of strategic milestones, in which case he retakes those tests. If he throws a 6, he gets elevated back up a stage to try and get back to green. And then it could well be that although he started with 42 as a continuous momentum total, maybe it fell down to 37. He's now committed a reserve unit that adds 6 to it, that puts it back to 43. Well, now he starts again with a continuous momentum total of 43, and 10% of that becomes his first milestone test. So he can commit reserves to the table and, if you like, reset his continuous momentum total at that point. Now, as I said earlier, what he's trying to do is to avoid a situation where his strategic condition falls to red, because if he then has to take another strategic condition test and he fails it, then that's it. His whole force will withdraw and the battle is lost. So what this is about for the senior command is making sure that his COs are rallying up continuous momentum scores wherever possible, that he is taking his milestone tests and committing reserves into the fray in order to keep the score up, and just making sure that he stays out of that nasty red zone. And that's about it. That's strategic conditions. So you can see that for each of the elements on the table, they're worried about their continuous momentum, and they're doing the moving and the firing and the reserving and all that kind of stuff, very much kind of tactical stuff on the table. You've got the COs, the commanding officers, company officers of those platoons, doing a bit of rallying, a bit of waving the flag, giving them orders, telling them what they should be doing, as you would expect. And behind them, you've got the senior command, who's obviously looking at the whole thing unfold on his battle map, making sure that everything is going as fine, but having the final decision as to whether or not we withdraw from the field, and he will be committing reserves into plug holes and to prop troops up whenever things start to go pear-shaped. And that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? If you've been ordered to hold a particular line and you've got a platoon or a company that is itself having difficulties, then it makes sense to commit another company into the line to shore them up. And it could be that you withdraw one of those damaged platoons out of the line, and therefore if you take them back into reserve to rest, then what you're doing essentially is withdrawing that continuous momentum score and resetting your continuous momentum score total to start all over again. So in that way, the senior command is doing what they should be doing in moving their forces to the best advantage to make sure that they complete their objectives. Now, as ever, these things are easier to show you in the real than they are to try and explain off a page. So what's going to happen going forward is that there'll be another game, and we'll bring some more elements onto the table, and we won't do a kind of dice by dice talk through as I did last time. It'll be a bit more of a kind of battle report this time, but we'll include the strategic conditions, milestone tests, all that kind of stuff that the senior command is undertaking, just to show how it fits into the game. So as I said, that's the last of the real fight your own battles mechanisms that you need in order to carry out a game. You've got all the other stuff prior to here. We're going to have a bit of a divert now. We're going to do a couple of videos next time out on some more background stuff, looking at baseboards that you might work on, the sort of scenery that you might need to try and make your game a bit more exciting. Then we're going to dive back into some of the more icing on the cake for Heroes All, some of the more peripheral stuff, things that you don't necessarily need to start the game. But one of the things that we are going to touch on, which we haven't looked at until now, is morale. The reason we went past morale is that we are, after all, talking about solo wargaming here, and Heroes All morale is very much a product of the two-player game. But we will pick up on that, touch on that briefly, see how that works. It's a very simple mechanism. And we're also going to start looking at a few things like the engineering rules and one or two other things besides. So thanks for sticking along. Stand by for the next set of videos, and I'll see you soon. Look, you know how this works. Give us a like, give us a subscribe, hit the notifications bell, and when more stuff arrives, you'll be the first to know.